Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. For my weekly reading report, it's time for my weekly reading report, the spellbinding program, where I talk about the stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read some stuff. Roger. So let's talk about the stuff that I read. I'll break out my list for the 500 book challenge. The ongoing challenge where I have to read 500 books I own before I'll buy any new ones. People have been sending me some books, Roger, but I can't buy any. So yeah, let's continue on with the list here. When last we spoke on this fantastic program last week, I was at book number 249, Night Ride and Other Journeys by Charles Beaumont. So I read this fantastic book for Horror Mayhem, which is one of my favorite BookTube events. Horror Mayhem, which was created by the Bookish Bryants and celebrates short horror fiction novels under 250 pages and short stories and novellas and stuff like that. And this is a collection of short stories by Charles Beaumont, who is best known for his Twilight Zone episodes that he wrote. A couple of those have become classics, and the story versions of both of those stories are in this book. And this was a really good book. Charles Beaumont could really write. He was excellent. Unfortunately, he died very young of a mysterious disease. And he was fantastic. So we lost a lot of great stories, I think, when Charles Beaumont passed away. He wrote for television. He was very talented. He wrote TV movies, I think. And he also wrote fantastic stories and a couple of novels. And this is an excellent collection. Some of these stories really fit in well with Horror Mayhem, but this wasn't just a collection of horror stories. This is also a collection of fantasy stories and a couple of stories that were not fantasy or horror. One of the best stories in this volume is a story called, let me get it right, A Death in the Country, which was a story about a race car driver. It was fantastic. That was a great story. One of the best, like I said, in this whole book. He wasn't the kind of writer that you could really pin down to one genre. And this book reflects that. But it does have a couple horror classics in here. It does have the stories that were made into Twilight Zone episodes. The Howling Man is his most famous story, I think, which was also a Twilight Zone episode. I think the story works, probably it works better than the episode did, although the episode's great. I think the story was just brilliant. Another story in here was Perchance to Dream. It's been a long time since I've seen that Twilight Zone episode, but from what I remember, it follows along with the story really close. It was almost exactly the same as the story from what I remember. It's been a while since I saw the episode. But the story is excellent. It's just an excellent little short horror story. And it's great. So many great stories in here. Yeah, great stuff. The New People, that was a creepy story. Just great stuff. So if you ever see this or any other book by Charles Beaumont, get it. He's less well known nowadays than he should be. There is a Penguin Classics edition of Charles Beaumont that I think is still in print, and you should buy that because that's also a great book. I have a video that I did on that book years ago, but it's still on my channel somewhere. It was called Perchance to Dream and Other Stories or something like that from Penguin. You should get that. I know that one's in print. And I think a lot of his other books you can get at least as ebooks. But he's worth hunting down, Charles Beaumont. This was fantastic. So that was number 249. Book 250 on the challenge, I've talked about quite a bit. That's this. This is The Gold Key Star Trek. I talked all about this last week and on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, so I won't go too much into it at the moment, but great fun. The Gold Key Star Trek comic books. This, of course, is for BookTrek. BookTrek 2025, in search of BookTrek. A great reading event created by Vin over at Revenant Reads. A lot of great co-hosts for BookTrek. It goes on for, I think, all of summer. And so I started a little bit early, but, you know, I was excited for BookTrek. I love Star Trek. And this was fun. It was weird. It's a very early Star Trek comic book. Everything looks a little wrong if you're used to the television series. But it's also tremendous fun. It was a good time. And yeah, it's awesome. So yeah, the Gold Key Archives Star Trek, book number 250. I read that. I'm going to continue reading Star Trek comics. I'm going to read regular books for BookTrek as well. The next thing I'm going to read for BookTrek, though, is another comic. And this is I think it's a forgotten comic book series. I never hear anybody talk about this. And this is the first DC Comics series of Star Trek comic books, which came out after Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan, and before In Search of Spock. And so on this cover, their first issue, Mr. Spock is not on the cover because Spock's dead. Spock was dead when this comic book came out. This comic book lasted a while. It lasted a fairly long time, I think, a few years, which is pretty good for, you know, a comic book based on Star Trek. They tend to come and go. But I remember this being fun. They had their challenges, though, DC Comics did when these comics were coming out, because they didn't know what was going to happen in the next movie. You know, a movie would come out and they'd have to write the comics in between the movies. So you had a few issues come out of this, and then The Search for Spock came out. And then after The Search for Spock, they had to keep making comic books, and they had no idea what was going to happen in Star Trek 4. So in the comic book, Spock got better and just came back and joined the crew of the Enterprise. And they had a different ship. It was been a long time since I read these. I was reading these when they came out. So they got a different ship. That wasn't the Enterprise. I forget the name of the ship. And they had all these adventures before Star Trek 4 came out. Well, if you've seen Star Trek 4, you know what happened immediately after Star Trek 3, which made all of those issues pretty much impossible. And so DC Comics had to find a solution for that. And I mean, stuff like that, awkward things like that happened. And it was interesting, but it's been years and years since I've read this series of comics. So I broke them out. I have most of the issues. I don't have all of them. We'll see how many I read for BookTrek this year. But I definitely want to read through that whole period in between Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4. That was interesting. So yeah, the DC Comic Books version of Star Trek, that's coming next for BookTrek. The next book I read, book number 251 on the 500 book challenge, was The Dark Domain by Stefan Grabinski, who was a Polish writer of fantasy and horror. And so this is a series of translated stories in this book. It's a collection of translated stories. And it's translated by Miroslav Lipinski. And it's really interesting. So these are really good stories. They're very, very, very weird. The Dark Domain really is the human mind, I think, for these stories, because these are very psychological horror stories, although they definitely have fantastic elements. So you have some psychological horror stories. You have stories where you don't know whether what's going on is just in the mind of the main character or not. There are some stories that are clearly supernatural or fantasy stories. They all give you the feeling they all have like this nightmarish quality. They all have the feeling of a dream or a nightmare, where there's all these weird things that are happening, yet they work in the context of the story. Like there was this one story about a fire chief who's fighting fire elementals, and the fire chief has a superpower. He cannot be hurt by fire. He can go into a burning building and the fire will not hurt him. He just has this power, which makes him an excellent fire chief. What is that? Oh, it's the guy who runs down the street in his bicycle selling ice cream. Anyway, I was wondering what that was. If you don't hear that, there's this weird beeping going on outside the manor. Where was I? Oh, yes. The Dark Domain. So there's this fire chief who's immune to fire. And it's just, you never find out why, this guy is immune to fire. He just is. Fire just doesn't hurt him. And he's battling fire elementals who he is convinced that these elementals are behind all of the fires that happen. And so he dedicates his life to battling them. And the story's about his ill-fated battle with the elementals. I mean, there's stuff like that in here. But there's also just some straight-up creepy stuff. There's a lot of sex in these stories, which kind of surprised me. He had no discomfort with that, with putting sex and sexual desire into his stories and into his characters, and they're really interesting. So, The Dark Domain, I highly recommend it. Yeah, The Vengeance of the Elementals, that was the story I was talking about. But this book is full of really cool, interesting, creepy stories. The Area was a creepy story. We've got a lot of really good stories. In the Compartment, that was creepy. It's just full of creepiness, this book. Highly recommended. I could not put him up there with Lovecraft or Poe or any of the great classic horror writers that I'm familiar with. But he is really, really good. And I wonder if there's anything that has been lost in translation. If I could read these stories in the original Polish, perhaps I would have a higher opinion of Grabinski. He's great, I know that. But I wonder if I had read him in the original language, what I would think. Because I think very often things get lost in translation. And I think that might be the case here. I get the feeling. But it's excellent. The Dark Domain. I highly recommend it if you ever find it. So that's the last book I finished, but it's not the last thing that I read. I am in the middle of this Robert Silverberg book. This is the Book of Skulls. The Book of Skulls, which is a short novel. How long is this? In this edition, it's 90 pages? And I'm halfway through it. It's about some college kids who go on a journey to find the Brotherhood of the Skull in the desert. And one of these kids is an expert on ancient languages, and he found in the college he goes to an old manuscript that had never been translated, and it turns out to be the Book of Skulls. And what the Book of Skulls promises is that if you find the Brotherhood of the Skull, and there are 4 of you, 2 of those people, if you take this challenge, 2 of the people will become immortal, and 2 will die. One has to give his life voluntarily, and the other will be murdered by the other 2. Like, one will be murdered, has to give his life, one has to sacrifice himself, basically. And the other 2, the surviving 2, will become immortal. And so it's about these college kids who find out about this, and the kid who translated the manuscript figures out where the Brotherhood of the Skull is located, which is in a desert in Arizona. And so they travel there. And they're going to be initiated into this order and go through this challenge so that 2 of them will become immortal at the expense of 2 who must die. And it's interesting. The first half of this is pretty much a road novel. You know, they're on the road to this place. And you don't know in the beginning whether this place actually exists or if it's, you know, all BS. And even at the point I'm at now, I don't know if it's a real thing that 2 of them will become immortal and 2 have to die. I don't really know if this is a fantasy novel or a horror novel. It doesn't strike me as being science fiction at all, but it's interesting, and I'll have a lot more to say about it next week. Because at this point, I don't know how this is all going to turn out. It is very well written, though. I'll give it that. The main characters, all 4 of these college kids, are all stereotypes, but I think they're deliberately created as stereotypes. And then you slowly throughout the book figure that because one's the Jewish kid, one is the gay kid, one is the jock, and one is the farm boy, right? But none of them, as you read through the book, and it's narrated by all 4 of them, you figure out that none of them really fit entirely into those stereotypes. So I think that was a deliberate choice on Silverberg's part. And it's really well written, like a lot of Silverberg's work is. And I have no idea how it's going to end at all. So don't tell me. But I'll talk more about this book next week after I finished it. So that's the Book of Skulls. Of course, I also read the Fantastic Four, which I'm reading all of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1961 to 1995. No, 96. It ran to 1996. And I'm in the 80s right now. I'm in 1985 when John Byrne was still working on the book. At this point, The Thing has come back from Battleworld, where he was hanging out. She-Hulk had replaced him on the team. While The Thing was gone, Johnny Storm and Alicia, The Thing's girlfriend, up to this point, fell in love. What Johnny doesn't know is that she's really a Skrull, which I think we find out later. If I'm remembering right, Alicia was a Skrull at this point. But I don't know for sure, but I think that's what was going on. Although John Byrne didn't know that yet. I don't think. Anyway, The Thing comes back, finds out about this, throws a fit, and quits the Fantastic Four. And so The Thing is off the team at the moment, and we're stuck with She-Hulk, which kind of sucks because The Thing is 9 million times better a character than She-Hulk. But John Byrne loves She-Hulk, I guess. At this point, Doctor Doom seems to have returned. I'm about to start issue 279. So Doctor Doom seems to have returned. He died in the comic, but of course he's not really dead. And he seems to have returned, and once again he has sent the Baxter Building up into space to blow it up. And from what I remember, reading this comic book back in 1985 when I was 14 years old, he does blow up the Baxter Building. But of course it's not really Doctor Doom. It's a fake Doctor Doom if I'm remembering right. But I haven't read this issue yet, 279, where our heroes get stranded in outer space temporarily. So yeah, that's where I'm at on the Fantastic Four. Still excellent. It's excellent. I just wish The Thing was still on the book. That's all. It's She-Hulk, you know. Oh well. That's not the only comic book I've been reading. I also started to read Aquaman. I know certain people are rolling their eyes right now because I'm reading Aquaman. So this is DC Finest, Aquaman, King of Atlantis, which has stories from 1957 to 1962 of Aquaman. Aquaman was published forever. He was a backup feature in different comic books, literally forever. And how many pages is this? It's like 615 pages or something of Aquaman. Originally, DC Comics was, a couple years ago, going to come out with a Silver Age Aquaman omnibus, but they canceled it because at the time the reprint program sucked. But they've really turned the reprint program around with these DC Finest books. They're awesome. I love them. I think they're the best. And now I'm reading Aquaman, and Aquaman's awesome. Aquaman just joined the Navy temporarily. He just joined the Navy. He's Aquaman. What can I say? So I'm reading this. And I'm also going to start, probably tonight, a revisit of The Tomb of Dracula. Steve Donoghue and I, once a week, do Epic Comic Book Wednesday, and he said, you know, we should return to Tomb of Dracula for Horror Mayhem. And you know what? He's right. And so I'm going to start reading Tomb of Dracula again tonight. And I will go through the series, which I have in a few different ways. I have all of the Tomb of Dracula series electronically, which is my least favorite way to read a comic book. I have an omnibus of Tomb of Dracula, but I also have the whole series in these old black and white essential volumes that Marvel put out. And this is my favorite way to read Dracula. You know, it just, the Gene Colan artwork just looks great in this format. And so, yeah, this is how I'm going to revisit Tomb of Dracula, which I will start tonight, actually. And then I will talk about what I've read and about this, my feelings of the series in general on Wednesday. This was a really, really interesting comic book series, Tomb of Dracula. It was, of course, the best of the horror comic books that Marvel came out with in the 1970s. But it was more than just a horror comic book. There was a lot of interesting things about this book, which I'll talk about on Wednesday. And I think that's everything. I've talked long enough. Join me tomorrow. I am way behind in the videos I wanted to make. I've had all of these videos that I wanted to make and haven't had time to make, which kind of sucks. But I'm hoping to be back tomorrow. I have some time set aside tomorrow morning to film. So I should be back tomorrow. And I'll be back on Wednesday for Epic Comic Book Wednesday. I hope to be back on Thursday or Friday. We will see. I'll be back here when I can. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.